It's the year 2006 and Nokia has just announced its new flagship, the Nokia N95. Back then, Nokia was at the top of the world, having sold the most phones globally for almost a decade in a row. Nokia N95 would be unanimously called the best equipped phone by all the reviewers. It seemed impossible that anyone could threaten Nokia's leading position in any way anytime soon. But then, in January 2007, a new player entered the mobile phone scene. The announcement of the iPhone shook the world and resulted in an opening of a new chapter in the story of mobile phones. That kind of development required a response from the biggest player on the market. Welcome to Myorknet, and this is the story of how Nokia lost the smartphone war.
After revolutionizing the world of portable music players with iPod, Apple entering the mobile phone market was, from the very beginning, anticipated to cause a major shift in the smartphone scene. Yet, it wasn't a sure thing, especially from the perspective of such a giant as Nokia. First iPhone wouldn't even make a dent in Nokia phone sales. On the contrary, in 2007, Nokia would sell 435 million, when Apple would sell barely over 2 million. It was also missing a lot of features that were already present on other smartphones at its price. One of the most glaring omissions was the lack of 3G support, which had been available on mobile phones since 2002. Another one was the subpar 2-megapixel camera without video recording capability. The first version of iOS also lacked the App Store. All of that is probably why Nokia didn't make haste to respond to the iPhone, having released Nokia N95 8GB, which was an improved version of the N95. Nokia, at least on the surface, rested on its laurels for some time. Since 2007, quite a few manufacturers had already implemented a touchscreen on their devices, especially after the iPhone premiered. But we would have to wait until late 2008 to see Nokia's first meaningful reaction to this development on the market. Still, Nokia wasn't brave enough to release a high-end touchscreen device like its competitors, and it tested the waters with a mid-range Nokia 5800 Express Music. Nokia was also so cautious that it positioned this new touchscreen phone as a part of the music-centered line of Express Music, so that even if the touchscreen wasn't enough of a selling point, the Express Music branding would. But all of this didn't save the 5800 from being compared to the iPhone, and in that comparison it didn't have many chances to shine. But let's take a look at Nokia 5800's hardware. While on the outside we won't find many premium materials like glass or aluminum, it still looks unique and nice to hold. Its back is made of rubbery plastic with a wave-like pattern finish. The empty crevice on the bottom left of the cover is the slot for the stylus, which is unfortunately missing from this unit. What's the main highlight of the rear cover though is the 3.2-megapixel camera with Carl Zeiss optics and dual LED flash, which are highlighted by a shiny frame. On one side it has all the controls like the volume button, the lock switch that locks and unlocks the device, and a dedicated camera button. The stereo speakers are positioned on the opposite side, where both the SIM card and the microSD flaps are located. Around the right, bottom and left sides of the phone there is a reflective red strip that is in stark contrast with the dark red color of the rest of the body. On the top we can find the microUSB port flap, the headphone jack, the charging port and the power button. Flipping the phone on its front, we can notice the three physical buttons: the answer call button, the menu button and the disconnect from call button. At the top there is Nokia and Express Music branding alongside a QVGA video call camera and the media key that allows us to access applications such as the music player or the browser. And finally, the star of the show, the 3.2 inches 360 by 640 TFT display that's surprisingly crisp with relatively good viewing angles. To account for its new touchscreen controls, Nokia 5800 was the first device to be equipped with the new version of Symbian OS, the S60 version 5. Unfortunately, the S60 V5 wasn't a very polished design and was probably the 5800's main disadvantage. Nokia had been using Symbian S60 on their devices since 2002, and along the way of its further development, Nokia managed to make it one of the most user-friendly and stable operating systems for mobile devices with button controls. But when Nokia decided to create a touch-operated version of the S60, it didn't inherit its predecessor's traits and turned out to be a messy patchwork of different features hastily put together. S60 V5 at launch was full of bugs and glitches, The user experience was inconsistent. For example, to open some menus, only one tap was required, but for others you had to tap the icon twice. It also lacked features like kinetic scrolling or multitouch, which made features like pinching to zoom impossible. Some of those issues were fixed with many software updates in the following years, but Symbian still had a long way to go to catch up to the seamless touchscreen interfaces of the iPhone or even Windows Mobile. The main and one of the very few advantages Symbian had over early iOS was multitasking capability that wasn't present on Apple devices. There was also another limiting factor that made Nokia 5800 outclassed by its competitors. The technology used for the touchscreen was the old resistive one that made using your fingers to control your phone a less accurate and responsive experience than on the new capacitive touchscreens and made using a stylus almost a necessity when using the virtual keyboard. So let's try playing the two games that came preloaded on the 5800 and find out how functional the screen is. The first pre-installed game is a platformer called Bounce Touch. Before Angry Birds, Bounce was probably the most well-known franchise of Rovi Entertainment. Bounce started its life on Symbian S80 in 2001 and quickly became an iconic game associated with gaming on Nokias, as it was often preloaded on its devices. It only made sense that Rovio would develop a new version of its most successful game for the touch-controlled Symbian S60 V5. Bounce Touch is basically the same game as released for the N-Gage 2.0 platform Bounce Boing Voyage, which was the first Bounce game in 3D but with touch controls, as the name suggests. Even though Bounce Touch came embedded with every Nokia 5800, and it seems like Nokia meant this game to be a showcase of the capabilities of their new OS and touchscreen device, it doesn't really do a good job at showing it. On the contrary, the game runs sluggish, and the controls aren't intuitive at all. It feels like the phone is struggling with rendering simple 3D graphics of the game, and it runs much worse than on the over 1 year older Nokia N95 80GB. What makes the controls the most confusing is how unresponsive and inaccurate they are, especially when using your fingers, but even with the stylus it isn't a smooth experience. What makes it even worse is the erratic camera behavior. The whole experience makes you feel as if the game is half-baked re-release of a button-controlled game that was hurriedly adapted for the touchscreens. The other game is Raging Thunder Global Race. It's an arcade racing game that originally premiered in 2007 on Nokia E90 communicator to showcase its capabilities. The game is in full 3D, yet the textures are a little bit low quality. The E90 didn't have a touchscreen, so only tilt motion controls were used for steering the vehicle. On the 5800 they are also set as default, but you can turn them off in the settings and use only touch controls. To cut to the chase, they are awful. It's basically impossible to use them without a stylus, and even still, they are worse than the gyro controls. And it's not like, even with the tilt controls, Global Race is an easy game. The whole touch control aspect is implemented in a confusing way. Not only do you have to pull your car in the direction you want, but even going through menus and choosing a car is a drudge. After playing the inbuilt and by that approved by Nokia as representative of their new platform, we have to admit that Nokia was right to treat them as such. These two games mirrored the chunky experience of using Symbian S60 V5 on the 5800. Just like in Bounce Touch and Raging Thunder Global Race, S60 V5 feels rushed and like a reheated S60 V3 with some barely functioning patchworks thrown at it to make it work with touchscreens. Using a stylus is a must, just like in the old PDAs that had been available for decades. The whole system fails to create a coherent experience for the user, and it feels like an experimental version of the OS released to test various elements of its interface before the full release.
Even though the 5800 Express Music wasn't a commercial failure and at its price point not a bad deal, still it left a lot to be desired. It wasn't even a real response to the iPhone and other high-end touchscreen devices. Nokia hadn't released a flagship phone since the N96, which didn't have a touchscreen and was in some ways a downgrade over the N95 8GB. So people were still waiting in anticipation for the biggest player on the market to show off its prowess and face the iPhone directly. Only a month would pass from the release of Nokia 5800 to the announcement of Nokia N97, a flagship Nokia device with a touchscreen. The ads hyped a comeback from Nokia, the expectations were high, and Nokia had to make up for the disappointment that was the N96. With their new phone. Finally, in June 2009, 2 years after the first iPhone released, the N97 would start selling. It might be disappointing that Nokia decided their premium class phone to be plastic all over, yet it's not the cheap kind of plastic, and it once again feels sturdy. On the back we won't find anything too eye-catching, besides the Nokia N series branding and the protective cover that hides the 5-megapixel camera with cloud-sized optics, autofocus and dual LED flash. Around all the sides of the phone is a silver strip that complements the silver frame of the screen module. It also integrates both the camera and volume buttons, making it all look connected with the same silver color. On the other side there is a lock switch and micro USB and stereo speakers. Turning the phone around to its front, you can see its 3.5-inch TFT touchscreen that's once again 360 by 640 pixels. On the top there is the VGA video call camera, and on the bottom the end call, answer call and menu buttons. All around this there is a shiny silver frame that incorporates the Nokia logo in an appealing way. And finally, the most conspicuous feature of the N97, its slide-out QWERTY keyboard. The sliding mechanism is certainly an engineering feat. When the phone has the keyboard open, behind the screen module we can find a hinge that has all the phone's representative specs written on it. All in all, Nokia N97 still has a high-end feel to it, even though it's mostly plastic. As we have learned, the worst elements of Nokia 5800 Express Music were its clunky OS and an imprecise touchscreen. Had Nokia managed to fix those problems on the N97? There hadn't been many changes in the main hardware. The processor is the same, the amount of RAM is the same. The touchscreen on Nokia N97 is made in the same resistive technology, so a stylus was included in the original packaging, but the phone doesn't have a stylus slot unlike the 5800. Nokia definitely knew that using a virtual keyboard on the 5800 wasn't the greatest experience, so that's probably why it decided to add a physical keyboard to the N97. The addition of it makes a difference. It definitely makes inputting text a less annoying task. Even using all the menus can be made more convenient with the D-pad included besides the keyboard. But Nokia isn't meant to be only used with a keyboard. It's a touchscreen device first and foremost, and it shows. You can do a lot of things with the keyboard, but for some things it's impossible not to use the touchscreen. For example, there isn't any button that allows you to go back. You have to click the virtual button on the screen to do something so basic. The touchscreen on the N97 is slightly bigger than on the 5800, but the resolution is the same for both, so it doesn't look as crisp, and the N97 screen feels less rigid to touch, so it isn't much of an improvement. Unfortunately, at its core, the touchscreen experience remains the same, and the only saving grace for the N97 is its QWERTY keyboard, but it isn't enough to compensate for the lacking touchscreen performance. And speaking of performance, the Symbian S60 version 5 is one more time the OS running on this Nokia device, and it hasn't changed much since the 5800. The only apparent change is the addition of home screen widgets. At its base, the S60 V5 user experience remains subpar and still lags behind other touch-based OSs, especially in 2009 when Apple introduced the iPhone 3GS only 10 days after Nokia released the N97. But let's go easy on Nokia. Let's compare the iPhone 3G's performance to Nokia N97's in some games. iPhone 3G's specs are basically the same as the first iPhone, so it should show us whether Nokia created at least the iPhone first-gen killer. The first game that's available both on the N97 and on the iPhone 3G is Spore Origins. Spore Origins is a mobile version of a hit PC game, Spore, and focuses on only a single phase of the original game, the cell phase. Let's start with the gameplay on the N97. What first catches the eyes is how small the UI is, and with that how hard it is to select anything using your fingers. Fortunately, this game has support for the physical keyboard, so that's the best way to interact with the menus. When it comes to controlling your cell, using the D-pad isn't the best option, as it only allows you to move in 8 directions at best when clicking 2 buttons at the same time, but it's more like 4 directions most of the time when using only one button at once. So on the other hand, there are touch controls which are better because they give you more freedom of movement, yet they aren't perfect. Unsurprisingly, that's because of the resistive touchscreen. But there is also another issue. The frame rate while swimming in the primordial ooze is really low, and the game almost comes to a halt when you consume any of the other cells, which is basically every few seconds. Now let's see how Spore Origins performs on the iPhone. From the start, you notice that this game is basically a different version of the game, with different UI and this similar look of the creatures. That's because the version of Spore Origins on Nokia N97 is more similar to the iPod Classic release of this game than the iPhone release. And yet, it still came out almost a year later on Symbian. The iPhone edition also adds a lot of extra content when compared to other versions of the game. Using the game menus on iPhone is made substantially easier by the capacitive screen, as expected. Surprisingly, you steer the cell by gyro controls, even though that's probably something the N97 would benefit from more. Overall, the gameplay is on another level, both on the feature, ease of use and performance side of things. No longer is the UI too small and the frame rate low. Another game available on both devices is Asphalt 4 Elite Racing, the next iteration of the famous mobile game series Asphalt with 3D graphics in HD and fast-paced gameplay should be a great benchmark for the capabilities of our two devices. Unfortunately for Nokia, there isn't much to say about Asphalt 4 on the N97, other than that it is unplayable. The game's framerate can be counted on the fingers of one hand. Both the touch and gyro controls are too sensitive, so every time you try turning, you do that with a full force. All that can be said about the Symbian S60v5 version of the game is that you should avoid it. The version you should play is the less demanding 2D Java version of Asphalt 4. It feels really bare bones, but at least it is playable at all. On the other hand, we have the iPhone port of Elite Racing. Here it is a completely different story. The game runs as it should, and of course the iPhone touchscreen makes every aspect of the gameplay better. Instead of a boring menu, we start in a garage where a 3D model of our race car is parked. Everything from the smoother framerate and different UI to the gameplay and better controls make this game on the iPhone a world above the N97 edition. There is no comparing the two. Having witnessed the gaming experience on both devices, we can draw some conclusions regarding comparison between the two smartphones in general. And the conclusion that we come to is that, like in Spore and Asphalt 4, what the user experience that the N97 offers us is a level below the iPhone. It feels like the iPhone is a cutting-edge device offering premium software and hardware, while Nokia is offering a rather archaic machine with an outdated keyboard. One of the main problems of the N97 was the lackluster quality control on both the hardware and software level. That resulted in the phone being shipped with two noticeable weak points: only 128 MB of RAM and a measly 50 MB free space on the internal disk despite its 32 GB total memory. With only stock apps installed, this wasn't much of a problem on the 5800, but on the N97, which added the new RAM-hungry widgetized home screen, Qt and other runtimes taking space on the system disk, new versions of Nokia apps that took more space on the C-disk and more RAM, and it quickly became a huge problem for the N97s to handle. It took Nokia another few months to fix many bugs, performance issues and add features like kinetic scrolling until the N97 was even usable. The last nail in the coffin would be the price at which the N97 was sold. The iPhone 3GS starting price was $199 and Nokia N97 launch price was $699. Nokia's overconfidence came at a cost. Instead of becoming the iPhone killer, the N97 would become more of a Nokia killer. It was the second time in a row that Nokia's flagship phone failed to deliver, and even though it was considered a financial success by Nokia with 2 million units sold, all of its glaring flaws made Nokia publicly apologize.
N97 has been a tremendous success for us when it comes to how many did we ship and how much money did we collect. But it has been a tremendous disappointment in terms of the experience quality for the consumers, and something we did not anticipate.
Even with the failure of the N97, 2009 wouldn't be a total disaster for Nokia. That's largely because of Nokia 5230's success, which became the best-selling smartphone at the time and the best-selling phone of the year 2009. The 5230 sold 150 million units, and it's because it was able to capitalize on the new trend of touchscreen devices becoming affordable, which led to it reaching the mainstream customer. It didn't offer anything revolutionary, it was nothing more than the cut-down version of the 5800 Express Music. It looks almost identical, but is admittedly less visually appealing. That's because it lacks all the flair of the 5800. The The 50-30 is slightly thinner and lighter, but the absence of the fancy pattern on the back and the reflective strip on the sides makes it look like a boring plastic bar. What's even worse, it didn't even come with a real stylus out of the box. On the front, it could be easily mistaken for the 5800 with only the video call camera missing. When it comes to the features, the Wi-Fi support got the axe, but at least it still has 3G. The Symbian S60V5, which runs on the 50-30, is similar to the one on the 5800 too. It doesn't include the widgets that the N97 introduced, but it's made more usable than on the older phones because of all the software improvements. Thanks to this, the omission of the stylus doesn't feel that bad, because the system is better at predicting where you want to click. Some apps take a bit longer to load, but in general the whole experience seems less junky than on the previous devices. It even comes with kinetic scrolling enabled from the start. Of course, at the core it remains an S60V5 with all its flaws and archaic quirks. Yet, with those prices starting at as low as $70 on a contract, all of its shortcomings become far less relevant, and make it unfair to compare it to all the high-end devices Nokia released before it. Nokia 50-30 stood no chance when compared to iPhone 3GS, but at its price point was a reasonable choice for an entry-level smartphone, which paired with the Nokia brand made it a smash success.
Before 2009 ended, Nokia launched their first capacitive touchscreen smartphone, the X6. It was the successor of the 5800 Express Music, so once again a music-oriented device. Nokia finally went up the ladder and joined the likes of Apple using the superior capacitive technology. Nokia X6 got praised for finally implementing this new technology, but it was still criticized for the lackluster software. Even though Nokia X6 was competing in the high-end market, it didn't offer much over the much cheaper phones like the 5800 or even the 5230. The X6 wasn't really a flagship, and Nokia N97 would remain at the top shelf product for over a year until October 2010. That's when the Nokia N8 came out. Nokia N8 wasn't just a small improvement over the N97, it was a generational leap that would make Nokia enter the modern smartphone era. It also seems that Nokia decided to listen to feedback and addressed most of the issues plaguing all their previous attempts at touchscreen phones. At first sight, this new Nokia flagship comes across as a premium device. Most of the N8's body is made of a single aluminum shell, with only the top and bottom parts made out of plastic to enclose the antennas. The plastic used to allow for signal to pass through is also of so high quality that you might just confuse it for metal. Besides the shiny Nokia N series lettering, what's most pronounced is the huge camera bump that houses a 12-megapixel camera with autofocus and cut-size optics. Nokia N8 was the third ever phone to have 12-megapixel camera on board. It also allowed for recording videos at 720p. But that wasn't all. The 1/1.83 inches image sensor was the biggest ever installed on a phone, and this would remain true until Nokia broke the record again in 2012. This allows for the camera to capture more light, and because of that, offers better low light performance, but also in general produces higher quality images with more detail and less noise. Add to that the inclusion of superior xenon flash, and it becomes clear that the N8's camera was outstanding for its time. To highlight their phone's camera capabilities, Nokia even created a short film called The Commuter, which was shot in its entirety by Nokia N8.
Your vehicle is still illegally parked. I shall now use lethal force.
While both the screen size and resolution remain the same as on the N97, AMOLED panel on the N8 is an obvious change for the better. And finally, a Nokia N series phone got a capacitive touchscreen, which also allowed for equipping it with a Corning Gorilla Glass screen. On the inside, Nokia N8 has a 680 MHz ARM11 processor, up from 433 MHz on the N97, and in addition has a dedicated Broadcom Video Core 3 hardware accelerator, which enables 3D graphics capabilities. When it comes to memory, the N8 doubles the RAM of the N97, while slashing in half the flash memory. the latter isn't the problem, because 16GB was more than enough for all your files at the time, and the former was a necessary upgrade, since 128MB wasn't enough even on the N97. But now comes probably the most important part, the software. Software was the one thing holding back previous Nokia touchscreen devices the most. It was out of question that outdated even at its release. Symbian S60 version 5 had to get an upgrade, and it did. Nokia N8 was the first device to come with Symbian 3, which superseded the S60 V5. One of its major changes was the introduction of a new Symbian OS kernel with hardware-accelerated graphics. At first glance, it doesn't seem very different from the previous version, but soon you can notice some differences. Foremost, the whole experience feels more user-friendly. No longer are there quirks like double tapping to open menus. There is also a new home screen layout that offers 3 panes worth of space that you can customize with plenty of widgets. The Task Manager also got an upgrade, now showing a small preview of all the apps running in the background. You need only one click to close them, unlike on the S60 V5. All of these UI improvements, combined with better hardware and the capacitive touchscreen, finally create quite a snappy, relatively cohesive and flagship-worthy experience on the N8. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses. For example, text input solution remained the same as on the S60 V5. The virtual QWERTY keyboard takes you to a new screen to do your text input and gets you back when you are done typing. That adds an unnecessary step that makes the experience less seamless and only wastes your time. Instead of taking the revolutionary approach of Microsoft with developing their new Windows Phone 7 from the ground up, Symbian 3 remains more of an evolutionary upgrade from the S60 V5, so it was inevitable that it would inherit some of its shortcomings. Even though Nokia stepped up their game and finally Symbian became comparable to iOS and Android, it still remained behind them. Speaking of iOS and Android, the competition was Nokia N8's greatest enemy. On its own, the N8 could be considered a great phone, but when compared to what other brands offered, it didn't look as impressive. No longer was the first-gen iPhone the main threat to Nokia, but in 2010, the N8 had to face fierce rivalry from likes of iPhone 4 and ever-growing list of Android devices, including the first Samsung Galaxy S. Side by side, those titans, Nokia N8 didn't offer neither better specs nor software, with only its camera being ahead of its time. The Achilles heel of the N8 was its weak ecosystem, in particular the Nokia Office Store. Just a month before the N97 released, Nokia introduced their new Office Store, which was its answer to the App Store. But from the very beginning, it had a long way to catch Apple's app marketplace. And in the end, it wouldn't ever be able to come close to reaching that goal. By the end of 2010, App Store already had 300,000 of apps available, while the Office Store wouldn't even reach 30,000. We can't forget about Android market, on which the number of apps grew by 500% in 2010 and reached almost 130,000 apps. No longer are the games for Nokia N8 completely different, inferior versions of the ones for other platforms, yet some differences still can be noticed. Sometimes a game runs slower, sometimes it has lower resolution textures, and sometimes all of the above, but at least they aren't a lot worse than on iOS and Android. But the biggest weakness of Nokia N8 gaming capabilities isn't its performance, but the lack of games available for Symbian. Both Android and iOS were rapidly getting more and more graphically or gameplay-wise impressive games, while Symbian wouldn't even ever get a dedicated Plants vs. Zombies port. To even have a chance to play this bestseller, the N8 owners would have to wait until 2012, when PopCap released the much cut-down J2ME port. In a figurative way, all of these drawbacks, when it comes to gaming, reflect all the main disadvantages of the Nokia 2010 flagship over its competition. The weaker specification, small app ecosystem, and still not fully up-to-date OS seem to be the main problems of Nokia N8. It doesn't mean that the N8 wasn't competitive or it wasn't a success at all. After all, it sold over 6 million units, and it was the most pre-ordered product in Nokia's history. But knowing its limitations, it is easier to understand why it didn't win Nokia the high-end phone market back.
Even though it might have seemed like Nokia had just taken their first step in the right direction to improve their Symbian devices, things turned out differently. Nokia N8 would become the last flagship Nokia device to be created. Only 1 month after the N8 premiered, Symbian's fate would be sealed. A After 2 years of existence, the Symbian Foundation would cease its development of Symbian OS, and Nokia was to take upon itself the governance of the Symbian platform. With all the major players like Samsung and Sony Ericsson leaving the foundation, Symbian would lose all of its chance of competing with iOS or Android, and would become mostly a Nokia proprietary system. It doesn't mean that all the development of the OS would be abandoned. On the contrary, in 2011 Nokia would release 2 new versions of Symbian 3, Symbian An and no longer called Symbian, Nokia Bell. These two would further refine Symbian 3 experience, making it by the end of 2012 as close to iOS and Android as it would ever get. The last high-end Nokia Symbian device would come out in a form of a true successor to Nokia N8. The Nokia 808 PureView, that would bring about an even more remarkable 41 megapixel record-breaking camera sensor. The 808 would offer the ultimate Symbian experience and is at least a worthy last chapter to the story of Symbian OS. But in 2012, Symbian was long sidelined by the Windows Phone and the new flagship Nokia Lumia series. Would Nokia phones survive if Nokia stuck with Symbian and continue improving it? That's unfortunately unlikely. The iPhone truly was a game changer, and the only systems that have a significant presence on the market today are the ones that sprung up around the dawn of the touchscreen revolution. Even a giant like Nokia couldn't fight back against the rise of Android and iOS, so who else but them possibly could?